Well, welcome, folks, to the Creation Seminar Part 6. This will be a continuation of what we covered last time on the Hovind theory. What caused the flood? But before we go into my theory of what caused all this, we have to review a little bit of science. When we started last time talking about some of the things about science that you need to be refreshed about, the Meissner effect, and about super cold comets in space. Some of the comets, most of the comets out there in space are extremely cold, like 300 to 400 below zero. Now, next thing you need to keep in mind, if you throw a snowball too fast, it'll break apart. I know here we are in Florida, probably some of you have never seen a snowball before, but it's the white stuff, you know, that falls out of the sky. You know, not the pigeons, but if you throw snow too fast, it will break apart in space. You couldn't shoot a snowball out of a cannon, it would break apart. It wouldn't hold together in one piece. So if a comet was going too fast, it would break apart. We saw that when the comet got sucked into Jupiter, Comet Shoemaker several years ago. They saw the comet headed toward Jupiter. It kept going faster and faster because gravity gets stronger the closer you get, the inverse square law. And as the comet got up to a certain speed, all of a sudden, poof, it just blew apart in space. There were 27 pieces that we could see from here that hit Jupiter. Who knows how many millions there actually were. But it broke up into thousands, at least thousands, probably millions of pieces. So comets are flying through space, but they have a maximum velocity or they will simply break apart. Next thing to keep in mind, the Earth has a very strong magnetic field, but the magnetic field is getting weaker. Which means back at the time of the flood, the magnetic field probably maybe even 8 or 10 times stronger than it is today. This magnetic field protecting the Earth. And next thing to keep in mind, super cold particles sometimes are easily magnetically deflected or statically charged. For instance, we have the northern lights. How many have ever got to see the northern lights? I've only been able to see them twice, once in South Dakota and once in Canada. I had to get to an airport, a 3-hour drive to get to the plane. I had to catch the plane at 7 in the morning. So at 3 in the morning, we left from the seminar to drive. So I laid in the back seat and looked out the window, and the northern lights were just going crazy that night. That's 3 hours, got to watch them. It's unbelievable. If you've never seen them, they're phenomenal. You guys seen them in South Dakota? You live there. You don't get to see, you got to go up at night to see them. Okay, well, they don't, not out in the daytime. Oh, they're out in the daytime, but you can't see them. The northern lights are caused by the phenomena of the particles being, or energy being deflected to the north and south pole from the Earth's magnetic field. I think the same thing could happen with super cold ice particles. Little fragments could be deflected to the north and south pole. Next thing to keep in mind, the pre-flood world was a lot different. They had a canopy of water or ice to protect them. We covered that in Seminar Part 2. And next thing to keep in mind before we give you the Hovind theory, who on earth is Peleg? There's a guy in the Bible named Peleg. If you read through Genesis chapter 10, it's kind of a boring chapter. I hate to say that, but it's kind of boring. You know, it's all them names that nobody can pronounce but Alexander Scorby. And you come to Genesis 10:25, and it says, unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided. All the rest of these guys in Genesis 10, it doesn't tell us anything about them. It says their name and his son's name and his son's name and his son's name. And all of a sudden it says, in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. And then it says his brother's name was Joktan. Well, nobody else gets their brother mentioned. Why would Peleg get his brother mentioned? Well, Joktan in Hebrew means shortening, and Peleg means divided. So who on earth is this Peleg? If you get the seminar notebook, the last page folds out to be this timeline. You can see Peleg on there, a couple of generations after the flood. Who was Peleg? Notice Peleg's daddy lived over 400 years. Peleg only lived 239. What happened? We'll cover that in a minute. Next thing to keep in mind, the pre-flood world had a canopy of water overhead and a layer of water under the crust of the earth. Mentioned in Psalm 33, Psalm 136, Psalm 24. This water used to be under the crust of the earth. Next thing to keep in mind, sometimes there are 2 ways to look at things. If you remember our seminar part 4, you know, how fast was that calf going anyway? 2 ways to look at things in this world. So I made a conscious decision 35 years ago as a brand new Christian. I had kids in school making fun of me for being a Christian and telling me the Bible's got contradictions and blah, blah, blah. I went through all the typical persecution of a young Christian. And I had to decide, I'm going to believe the Bible until it is proven wrong. Some people have decided they are not going to believe the Bible until it's proven right. I think that's a mistake. One atheist came to the preacher one day and said, I don't believe the Bible. I don't believe anything in the Bible. I believe science. He said, if you can prove 1 verse out of the Bible scientifically, I'll believe it. The preacher said, okay. He grabbed the atheist around the neck, grabbed his nose, and began twisting his nose back and forth till the blood started coming out. The atheist said, man, what are you doing? He said, well, the Bible says the wringing of the nose bringeth forth blood. I was just proving it to you, you know. I don't recommend you do that, but it is in there, folks, okay? Anyway, here's the Hovind theory. What I'm going to do is supposed to be a good teaching technique. I don't know if it works or not, but I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. Then I'm going to tell you what I told you. So we'll go through this real fast, real slow, and then real fast at the end to kind of give a conclusion of what caused the flood, what froze the mammoths, why is the earth tilted, why do we have seasons, what froze the mammoths standing up. 8 points to the Hovind theory, very simple. I think Noah and the animals got safely into the ark. Number one. Number two, a 300-degree below zero Fahrenheit ice meteor came flying through space. As it got closer to some of the planets, it broke apart. And some of the fragments made the rings. Some of the planets have rings around them. Why do Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune have rings? Rings made of ice. What happened? As it got close to the Earth, some of the fragments would tend to be sucked into the North and South Pole. And so the Earth got snowed on with extremely cold, like 300 or 400 below zero snow, mostly around the poles. Now, a lot of it would vaporize, I know, coming through the atmosphere. But just like you can spray a hose right through the middle of a fire, some of it will make it out the other side. If you get enough going in the same direction, it'll develop a cold channel right through the middle of a hot fire. Super cold ice could dump in on the Earth and make a cold channel right through a warm atmosphere. If you get enough of it going at the same time, coming fast enough. Then the fourth thing that happened, this dump of ice on the North and South Pole caused the Earth to crack, releasing the fountains of the deep, caused the Earth to wobble from the extra weight on the North and South Pole, and the rapidly spreading ice, you keep dumping ice in one spot, it's going to spread out, and went sliding across the countryside, carving the glacier effects that we still see today. It caused the burial of the mammoths. They're frozen standing up, food in their stomach, and they suffocated. It caused the Earth to wobble for a few thousand years. It made the canopy that used to protect the Earth collapse, because when warm air hits cold air, it rains. And it opened up the fountains of the deep, and the water came shooting out from inside the crust of the Earth, like the Walt Brown's hydroplate theory shows. Then, during the first few months of the flood, the dead animals settled out and were buried. And plants were buried by the bazillions. And the big piles of plants became coal, and animals turned into oil, natural gas, or fossils, depending on how they're buried and how deep they're buried and what conditions they're buried in. That became the coal and the fossil graveyards over the next few hundred years. Then during the last part of the flood, the unstable plates of the Earth would crack and shift and move around. Some places lift up, other places sink down. Water's going to fill in the low place. If we filled this room full of water, lifted up one end of the room, the water would rush down to the low end. I think the plates of the Earth tilted and water ran off, forming the mountain ranges, the canyons, and the trenches. We'll cover that in a minute. As the ocean thin spots sank down, they became the oceans. Other spots lifted up, they became the continents. And the runoff caused enormous erosion. Grand Canyon probably formed in a couple of weeks. Over the next few hundred years, the ice caps would slowly melt back. This is going to raise the ocean levels slowly. That's the only thing to explain the continental shelf. Why do we have a continental shelf out there? That explains the shortening of the lives in the days of Peleg, from CO2 being absorbed by the water. And we can still see today the devastating effects of this flood. So that's the Hovind theory in a nutshell. Let's go over to a little more detail now. God made a perfect world. Man wrecked it with his sin. God said, I'm going to destroy it. Noah built a boat. God said to Noah, get in with all the critters. God said to Noah, come thou, Genesis chapter 7. That is a good sermon right there. God didn't tell Noah to go into the ark. He told him to come into the ark. Where does God have to be in order to say that? In the ark. That'll preach. Later he said, go out of the ark. He didn't say come out of the ark. God was in there with him the whole time. I don't mind taking a one-year cruise with all the critters on board if God's in there with me, okay? So that'll preach. And then the Bible says the Lord shut him in, Genesis 7, verse 16. If God shuts the door, it won't leak. Good eternal security verse. If you're in Christ, you're safe, okay? People say, you think you can lose your salvation? Absolutely not. Are you kidding? I didn't deserve it before I got it. I didn't deserve it while I was getting it. I don't deserve it now. If I could lose it, I never would have it. Nobody would have it, okay? I'm sealed in Christ, not sealed because of what I did. It's because of what he did. So then I think what happened, Noah's in there safe and sound. A 300-degree below zero ice meteor comes flying through space and starts to crack up in space. Some of the fragments become rings around the planets. Some of them make craters. You know, a chunk of ice would hit a planet, make a crater, and then later vaporize and disappear, leaving behind the hole but no evidence of what hit it. Ice would do that, okay? Some planets have rings around them. At least 4 planets have these ice rings. And they're made of not only ice, but also rock and ice. Now, Walt Brown thinks that the rings around the planets came from Earth. He thinks the fountains of the deep broke open and shot stuff up into space. He thinks the comets flying around through space came from Earth. Good theory. I don't know if you could prove that or not, but it's have to go pretty fast to get away from Earth's gravity, you know. But you get supersonic stuff shooting out of the ground from the, you know, rocks blasting up from the fountains of the deep. It's a good theory. Could be true. I don't know. But these comets flying around through space are certainly super cold ice. As this sections of the comet, or maybe the tail of the comet, got close to the Earth, it would be sucked in because of the Earth's magnetic field. It would be deflected mostly to the north and south poles. So the Earth got hit mostly around the poles. Some fragments might make it through. The big ones might make it through, and actually leave behind craters that after the flood would still be visible. Maybe eroded some from the flood, but there could be craters. I don't know if the Yucatan Peninsula crater is an example of that, but there could be craters, or the big one in Quebec, Canada, 47 miles across. Something huge hit Quebec, left a 47-mile crater. That could be from this ice, I don't know. But also, super cold ice is easily statically charged. We have a Van de Graaff generator at our place, so you can go over there and stick your hand on there and poof, make your hair stand up. You've all seen those before, right, in physics class? A lot of fun. Come on over and you can try ours. Well, here's my theory. I think a super cold ice meteor came toward Earth, broke apart. Most of the fragments landed on the poles. This caused the Earth to wobble, cracked the crust, released the fountains of the deep. The canopy overhead then would collapse because super cold air coming off of this ice cap. Just like when you open the freezer, you can see the cold air flow out. Well, cold air is like we get the Canadian winds come down, you know, and from Canada and freeze the people down in Texas primarily. There are cold fronts that move off of big masses of cold ground. That would happen at the time of the flood and for the next few hundred years, actually, from this ice cap sending off these cold waves. They're still coming today, actually. Scientists just discovered here a few years ago there are still massive amounts of ice hitting the Earth all the time. Earth gets clobbered by big chunks of ice as big as a house. It melts in space and ends up coming down just as moisture, but we're getting a lot of ice and water added to the Earth from this phenomenon. I think this is remnant ice floating around from 4,400 years ago at the time of the flood. This article talks about water everywhere in space. Finding lots of chunks of water, amounts of water and chunks of ice in outer space. Now, when they went, this map shows the North Pole kind of from a strange view. It shows Greenland down at the bottom lower right and Russia to the upper left. But it shows what the North Sea would look like without the water in it. There's an island up there, up at 10 o'clock on your map, called the New Siberian Islands. There on those New Siberian Islands, they find frozen bobcat, frozen camels, frozen bison, frozen mammoths. What's a camel doing up near the North Pole? And some of these camels are 15 feet tall. I mean, a really big camel. What happened? How do you freeze animals up near the North Pole? And why were they there? Well, I think before the flood came, the world probably had very, very small ice caps, if any, because it wasn't tilted as much as it is today. If the Earth were not tilted quite so much, we'd have almost, springtime all the time. There still would be probably small polar ice caps just because of the angle of the sun. There'd probably be colder weather at the north and warmer at the equator, but nothing like it is today. When they drill down through the ice, sometimes they find strange things. Like in Antarctica, they drilled down, which is at the bottom of the world here. Oh, we call it the bottom. Of course, you can't tell when you're standing there, but at the south end of the world, they drilled down through the ice and hit coal. There's enormous evidence of huge forests in Antarctica where there's not one tree growing today. There's not a blade of grass growing down there. Admiral Byrd said he found frozen palm leaves under the ice near the South Pole. Here's an article telling about 400 miles from the South Pole, they find dinosaur footprints and dinosaurs. And thousands of well-preserved leaves found in Antarctica. What happened? 250 miles from the South Pole, they find frozen leaves on the side of a cliff. There are no trees there. None. Zero. This article talks about the discovery of these leaves. They have their original cellular content. These leaves are not fossilized. They're still leaves. Up in Alaska, they found dinosaur bones and dinosaur tracks in Alaska. It's cold in Alaska. Actually, there's a good book by some guys who went up to northern Alaska and found frozen dinosaur bones, not even fossilized, called The Great Alaska Dinosaur Adventure, Great Alaskan Adventure, or something like that. We can get it through our bookstore. But frozen dinosaur bones, not even fossilized. Well, we cover more on that in video number 7. The Earth actually has 2 North Poles. We have what's called the geographic North Pole. We spin around that one. And we have a magnetic North Pole up here in Canada. Your compass points to the magnetic North Pole. Now here in Florida, it doesn't affect us because we're pretty much straight line. But if you live in Alaska, there's quite a difference. Pilots have to really watch for this angle of declination because the North Pole is not really the North Pole. And they have to allow how many degrees to change their navigation based upon, because it's pointing magnetic north, not geographic north. It appears that the Ice Age, you can look at the map here, it appears that the Ice Age is centered around the magnetic North Pole. There was more ice in America than there was in Russia, for instance. The Ice Age effects came down further. Here's what I think happened. The mammoths were up there chomping on their tropical flowers, enjoying a wonderful meal, and all of a sudden it began to snow. They had never seen snow before. So one of them said, Herman, this is peculiar weather we got going on here. Let's get out of here. They started running around, and the snow got deeper and deeper, and pretty soon they ended up in snow so deep they couldn't even fall over. How many of you have ever been in snow so deep you couldn't fall down? You don't get that in Florida much, but you guys do in South Dakota, don't you? And the mammoths ended up standing up, suffocating in 300 below zero, super cold snow. They froze in 5 hours under those conditions. Because a large chunk of meat takes a long time to freeze. You ladies know if you freeze or thaw a large turkey or something, it takes 24 hours to freeze or thaw 12 inches. Well, the mammoths are found frozen so quickly the food in their stomach is still green, still recognizable. It didn't keep digesting after they died. As the ice would go spreading out across the countryside, it would leave behind scratches in the rock like you see in Kelly's Island, Ohio, or all across Indiana or Illinois. There are glacial grooves. Yes, there actually was an ice age, but it wasn't millions of years ago. I think it was triggered at the time of the flood. There are basically two theories about the ice age among creationists. One theory says the flood caused the ice age. My theory says the ice age caused the flood. Very similar. I think the ice age actually caused the flood to start. I don't think you're going to explain 5 million mammoths perishing at one time if the ice age came after the flood, because mammoths are a little slow reproducing. It takes a couple years to have a baby mammoth, okay? And to get 5 million of them is going to take a long time. So I think the ice age had to come in and triggered the flood. Then the ice would still last for a few hundred years afterwards, but probably that was the trigger. So the earth had these big cold spots. Cold air hits warm air, causes it to rain. It rained 40 days and 40 nights. The canopy that used to protect the earth collapsed, and everybody drowned. The Bible says the fountains of the deep broke open. I think because of the impact, or maybe because of the weight of the earth, or the changing in the tilt, or just the near miss of a comet, just something going by, the gravitational tug would flex the crust of the earth, causing it to crack. Several things could have happened, releasing the fountains of the deep. If you get the book of Jasher, we sell it in our bookstore. I don't know that this is the one mentioned in the Bible, okay? There's a book of Jasher and a book of Enoch mentioned in the Bible. There are some floating around in circulation. Neither may be legitimate. It appears the book of Enoch is actually a forgery by one of the cults who wanted to document, to say, well, the Bible says right here, certain doctrines, things that they teach. So they wrote their own book of Enoch, knowing nobody had ever found the book of Enoch. Book of Jasher may be that way too, I don't know. But it says in Jasher chapter 6, on that day the Lord caused the whole earth to shake. And the sun darkened, and the foundations of the earth raged, and the whole earth was moved violently. And the lightning flashed, and the thunder roared, and all the foundations of the earth were broken up. Fascinating book to read. If you want to get the book of Jasher, it's like $10 in our bookstore. But I think this is another description of what happened at the time of the flood. The earth actually broke apart. Something caused it. Walt Brown says the earth was stretched, over the water. I agree, but he doesn't have a mechanism. And I talked to him about it. I said, what caused the earth to crack? He said, I don't know. It just did. Well, maybe so. But I think, outer space meteor strike is one possible solution to that. So this dump of ice on the poles caused the earth to crack. That released the fountains of the deep. The rapidly spreading ice caused the ice age effects. It caused the burial of the mammoths. It made the earth wobble for a few thousand years, and it made the pre-flood canopy collapse. It rained 40 days and 40 nights, and the earth was completely covered by water. The Bible says in Genesis chapter 7, all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. This is not a local flood. When I debated Hugh Ross on the John Ankerberg show for 3 hours, I said, Dr. Ross, do you believe in a universal flood? No, I said, do you believe in a worldwide flood? He said, I believe in a universal flood. Now, I know what he really believes, and I thought that was a deceitful answer. I said, what do you mean a universal flood? He said, well, it flooded Noah's little universe, which was the valley that he lived in. There was no reason to flood the whole world, he says, because, why kill the penguins? They didn't do anything wrong. Well, that sounds good, but it's not scriptural, okay? The Bible says the hills were covered. The whole mountains were covered. If you shrank the earth down to the size of this 12-inch globe, all the water in the oceans would not even fill a tablespoon. at this scale. I mean, I flew back over to the Pacific. I told one of the guys in my office, I said, man, the Pacific Ocean is huge. And he said, oh, that's just the top of it. That's quite a thought. But even though there's huge amounts of water on this planet, when you shrink it down to this scale, it won't even fill a tablespoon. 3 miles of water spread over the world is thinner than the paper on this globe at this scale. This is 8,000 miles across the earth. 3 miles compared to 8,000 is nothing. And if you smoothed out the earth right now, if you just smoothed it out, push the mountains down, lift the oceans up, level everything out, there's enough water out there right now to cover the earth 1.5 miles deep. Everywhere. People say, where'd all the water from the flood go? Oh, it's still here. It's gathered into big puddles called oceans. The water's still here from that flood. And the Pacific Ocean is gigantic, and that's just one of the oceans, okay? When they climbed Mount Everest in 1953, they began to find something strange up near the top of Mount Everest, the tallest mountain that we know of in the world. They began to find petrified clams in the closed position. Petrified clams on top of Mount Everest. Up in Peru, 2 miles above sea level, recently they found giant oysters 11.5 feet wide, weighing 600 pounds. Petrified oysters in the closed position. Now you can walk along the beach here in Pensacola and find 1 billion seashells. You hardly ever find a matched pair, and you never find them closed if they're dead. As soon as they die, they open. How do you get petrified clams in the closed position on top Mount Everest? Well, Your Honor, I'd like to argue, first of all, that Mount Everest is a little ways from the beach. Okay, right there. Number 2, clams don't climb mountains very well. Number 3, when a clam dies, it opens. So how can we explain petrified closed clams on top of Mount Everest? One atheist I debated said, do you think the water covered Mount Everest? I said, well, Mount Everest was underwater, but Mount Everest wasn't there. The mountains actually arose during the last part of the flood. Sometimes they find petrified clams in beds up to 10 feet thick. Solid petrified clams. 10 feet. A guy in Alabama, I spoke up there in his church in central Alabama. He said, hey, you want some more petrified clams? I said, yeah. Why? He said, they're 4 feet thick in my backyard. Every time I rototill my garden, I bring up thousands of petrified clams, closed. I got a bunch of them here, little tiny ones. Petrified clams in the closed position. I think that's evidence they were buried alive in mudslides, which would happen during the flood, and they woke up dead and couldn't open. And they ended up petrified. It doesn't take long for things to petrify. Petrified eggs are found, like this picture here shows. We've got 3 dinosaur eggs on the table. You can come see. Those are real petrified dinosaur eggs. Petrified jellyfish. Petrified octopus arm. Soft-bodied creatures just don't petrify today. They get eaten by somebody. Even animals don't petrify in the jungle of Africa. They get scattered all over the place. You know, the bones are dragged around, and even the bones get chewed up. What happened? Well, the Bible says the fountains of the deep broke open. I think the earth got hit, it wobbled for a while, and it cracked apart. And the water underneath that used to be there, mentioned in Psalm 136 and Psalm 24, came shooting to the surface. Then this dump of ice would cause all these effects that we talked about, and the earth, the canopy would collapse. It rained 40 days and 40 nights. We still have the scars today where the earth broke open. They're called the fault lines. And you can study earth science from this perspective, and it makes a whole lot more sense, I think. The hot water coming out from inside the crust of the earth would hit the regular water and kill critters like crazy. As the water came shooting out, it's going to lift up the basalt underneath as the continental plates slide back. As they slide back, it's going to cause it'll make what's called wrinkled mountains, folded mountains. In British Columbia, where I was yesterday, they have mountain ranges there that are obviously pushed from the end, and it's wrinkled up. Wrinkled mountains like this have to be pushed from sideways. This water came shooting out, probably would kill everything in the ocean within a few hundred miles of the cracks. Because hot water, when it hits regular water, kills the fishies. If you poured a gallon of boiling water into your aquarium, you would kill the fishies within a certain radius, okay? And when hot water comes out, it does that. All over the world, diatomaceous earth is found, sometimes in huge collections like the one in Lompoc, California. Now, diatoms are really, really tiny, glass-bodied creatures. Under the microscope, they look gorgeous. There's some diatoms here. When they float around in the ocean, they die. When they sink to the bottom, then their kids die and sink to the bottom, and their grandkids die and sink to the bottom. And it takes about 1,000 years to get 1 inch of diatoms. They are so tiny. You can take diatomaceous earth, you can buy it at the hardware store, and you can sprinkle around your house, and it is so tiny, insects get it stuck in the pores of their skin, and it kills the insects. It's a good, purely natural insecticide. It's real cheap. Diatomaceous earth is used in swimming pool filters. It's used in detergents. It's used in fertilizers. It's used for kitty litter. Oil dry is made of diatomaceous earth. Well, I went out to Lompoc, California, when I was preaching out there. I went and visited the largest diatomaceous earth quarry in the world, I think. The diatomaceous earth is 1,500 feet thick. They dig it out with bulldozers and, huge cranes. They're digging out this diatomaceous earth. I asked the guy, the foreman at the job there, I said, do you find anything unusual in this diatomaceous earth? He said, oh, we find millions, probably trillions of fossils. Here's a fish fossil in diatomaceous earth. These little herring are found by the billions. Actually, he gave me a chunk of diatomaceous earth from the quarry. This is it right here. It's just like chalk, so if you handle it, it's going to break. It's real lightweight. This one little square foot here probably contains 40 to 60 fish fossils. Can you see the skeletons in there? Just in 1 square foot. He said it's this way everywhere. What happened? They were digging in the diatomaceous earth quarry in 1976, and they came across the skeleton of a whale. A baleen whale standing on end. The whale was 80 feet long. Now, the layers of diatoms were also tilted, so it wasn't the height of the whale that becomes the problem, but the thickness of a whale, maybe 8 or 10 or 15 feet thick. Now, if it takes 1,000 years for an inch of diatoms to accumulate, how are you going to preserve an entire whale skeleton? You think the whale's going to lay at the bottom of the ocean for 50,000 years waiting to get preserved? No, I think something's going to go eat it, right? The rapid accumulation of diatoms, to me, indicates there was a flood when hot water came shooting out, and it just so happens Lompoc, California, is right on the San Andreas fault line. I think that's one of the places where the earth cracked open, the water came out, and it killed the diatoms within a few hundred miles, and they snowed to the bottom. And the swirling waters would put them in big, huge, thick layers, and they're digging them out today. And there's a big chunk of it right there. You can come see for yourself, the diatomaceous earth. The chalk cliffs of Dover, also 300 feet thick of solid chalk. Actually, the Latin word cretia means chalk. So the Cretaceous age, they talk about in the textbook, comes from the age of chalk. That's all baloney. There wasn't a chalk age. There were layers of chalk formed during the flood. Thick layers of chalk, sometimes accumulating in little piles. And its calcite would get together and end up in huge piles like they have in the chalk cliffs of Dover over there, 300 feet thick. The Bible says in Genesis 7, the waters prevailed and increased greatly upon the earth. And the ark went upon the waters. In the Hovind theory, during the first few months of the flood, dead animals would settle out. They would get buried. Swirling water would tend to make them go in little eddies or end up with fossil graveyards. Moving water, if you go along a river during flood stage, you'll see little eddies, swirling, little mini whirlpools. Stuff tends to accumulate in those. And then when it gets buried, you'd get, piles of gravel, for instance, like they have in South Bend, Indiana. Huge gravel beds. Probably the whole Florida peninsula is all basically sand. Maybe that was a big swirling eddy that deposited a giant sandbar, which we call Florida, and live on today. This would happen during a worldwide flood. Many of the features of the earth, if you think of it from a flood perspective, this is the best explanation to explain these things. Moving water automatically sorts particles by density. Heavier stuff drops out first. As the current slows down, different stuff drops out. We've got this thing on the table here. You can play with these things all day. You can buy them at the mall. Different colors of sand. When you flip it over, as the sand drops down, it automatically makes more layers. There's only two different colors of sand in there, black and white, 2 different densities. Why doesn't it just make all the dark stuff at the bottom or denser and all the light stuff at the top? And instead, it always makes multiple layers. During a flood, you get the same phenomena, not just denser at the bottom and lighter on top. You'd get them all mixed together. And it'll make many layers. You can watch it. We're talking about something else. You don't have to watch it. You can watch it all the time if you like. But anyway, these multiple layering happens during a flood also. There are several phenomena that happen with rapidly moving mud. Underwater landslides are called turbidity currents, and they can go incredibly fast. Back in 1929, the transatlantic cable was cut. They had an earthquake, and it was a mudslide underwater. There were several cables. They knew how far apart they were, and so when one cable got snapped and the next cable got snapped, they knew the exact times when the cable was snapped. And they calculated the mud was going 70 miles an hour underwater and covered 40,000 square miles. One underwater mudslide Can you imagine during Noah's flood how many thousands of square miles of things would be covered by mudslides just from the water moving around? Swirling water would tend to put critters in big swirling eddies, and they would rot. While they're swirling around for 3 months, the head rots off, the ribs rot off, the tail rots off, the legs rot off, and you end up finding, like this picture shows, dinosaur bones in twisted, contorted positions. Here's a dinosaur backbone, no head, no ribs, no feet. Tangled up messes called fossil graveyards. There's a fossil graveyard discovered in 1934. It said the concentration of fossils was like logs in a jam. Fossil graveyards are found all over the world. I mean, there are thousands of these. Huge piles of things died, or got buried at least, in one place. Doesn't tell us where they died, we just know where they ended up getting buried. Here's a picture showing 4 dinosaurs, or small hoofed mammals, I'm sorry, not dinosaurs, 4 of them in Nebraska that were found in the swimming position. They're all fossilized, but they were swimming. Probably in water getting muddier and muddier, and they ended up getting buried, drowning in that position, and covered and fossilized. It doesn't take long for things to fossilize. There's a place in Africa called the Karoo Formation. Estimates are there are 800,000 million. That's 800 billion vertebrate animals buried in this one big formation across Africa. What happened? Well, there was a flood. Back in 1878, they found in a coal mine in Belgium iguanodon skeletons running through 100 feet vertically of rock. All these iguanodon skeletons, at least 100 feet of rock deposited very quickly, obviously. Up in northern Canada, there's a place called Ellis Island. There on Ellesmere Island, there are no trees at all, none, yet they find petrified redwood stumps up there. There are certainly no redwood trees growing up there in northern Canada, okay? There are only a few select locations where they grow along the California coast and up into Oregon a little bit. And it doesn't take long for things to petrify, not at all. Things can petrify very quickly. We've got some examples here on the table of things that petrified very quickly. I'll show you those in a second. Here's a picture of a petrified water wheel. Here's petrified firewood. It was chopped on before it got petrified. You can go to Southern Forest World Museum in Georgia, Waycross, Georgia. There's a mummified dog stuck inside a tree. Some people say it's petrified. I don't know if it's mummified. I've not been there yet. But anyway, how can a dog get mummified just in probably a few years? Chased a coon up the tree, got stuck. They named it Stucky, of course. That's the name for the dog. They had a contest to name it, and so they called it Stucky. They cut the tree down for firewood. There's a dog inside. Here's a petrified cowboy boot with the cowboy's legs still in it. The boot was made in the 1950s. Got his leg shot off or torn off or who knows what, but there's his leg petrified. Here's a petrified fish giving birth. A petrified hammer was found from a marine barracks from World War II. Petrified hammer. Petrified hat found in New Zealand. There's a kid sent me this right here on the table, a petrified crayon found in Arizona. I mean, the crayon is turned to stone. We have right here a petrified pickle. It's in our museum. Well, it's here tonight, but a guy sent me this and the jar with it. The jar is still in our museum. He said, Brother Hovind, I found this old house in Montana. The roof was gone. The house had been empty at least 30 years. But we were digging around through what's left of this house and found the pantry. And there were pickle jars in there, but the lid to one of the jars rusted, and the pickle inside turned to stone. Would you like it for your museum? I said, well, yeah, of course. One kid wrote me a letter. Here's the letter right here. He said, Brother Hovind, I was 8 years old doing a science experiment. I put a bunch of acorns in a bucket of water to see if they would sprout. And I forgot about them. A year later, my mom saw the bucket on the back porch. She said, get rid of that bucket and all that junk out there. He said, the acorns had turned to stone in 1 year. I have right here a baggie of petrified acorns. It doesn't take long, folks. Don't let them tell you it takes millions of years for things to petrify. It's not true. A guy sent me a picture of a petrified pin cushion. The pin cushion, you can see the pins had rusted off except where you can see the rust marks where the pins had been stuck in there. Petrified pin cushion. They dug up a grave in Tennessee several years ago. They found the body of the person inside the grave had petrified, turned to stone. The doctor died and they buried him. 14 years later, his wife died. This is back in 1881. They dug a hole to bury Grandma, and water went into the hole. And they thought, oh, we don't want to bury Grandma in the water, so they buried her someplace else. Then the kids got worried about Grandpa in that moving water. It hit an underground spring, apparently. So they dug up Grandpa. He'd been in the ground 14 years. And the article says, the occupant of the coffin had been turned to stone, presumably as a result of the a continual flow of water. It said the arms had rotted off, but the rest of the body had turned to stone, petrified. A guy found a petrified man in Montana. He took it 5'8". They got carried around as a museum curiosity for years in carnivals and fairs and stuff. Petrified body of a man found on the beach in Montana, in a beach of a river. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, a lady went into the hospital. She said, my side's been hurting. The lady was 62 years old. They x-rayed her and found a petrified fetus, a baby, inside. She had been pregnant. The baby almost came to term and died, apparently, and turned to stone inside her body. 62-year-old lady with a petrified baby inside. Here's the article. You can read it for yourself. I met a guy in Maryland who said he worked at a hospital, Brian Lackey, who lives in Washington, but there's his phone number. He was in Maryland. He said they brought a lady in there and took out a petrified fetus out of her body. The baby's in the museum now, or in a medical hospital up there. Petrified fetus. Here's petrified sacks of flour found in Arkansas. A flour mill flooded. The flour turned to stone. The sacks of flour were buried in water and mud and turned to rock. There's our petrified pickle right there. You can see the jar it was found in. Come by our museum at Dinosaur Adventureland and see all this. So it's true there are layers to the earth. It's also true they can form very quickly. I think the flood's the best explanation for this. Skeptics will say, wait a minute, why are all dinosaur bones found in the same layer? First of all, they're not, okay? But it is true there is a little bit of sorting to the fossils, okay? And I think there's a better explanation for that than evolution. They're only told in school this is showing an evolutionary pattern. This is pure baloney in my totally unbiased opinion. First place, the fossils are not sorted clearly like the textbook says. David Ropp said, one of the ironies of the evolution-creation debate is the creationists have accepted the mistaken notion that the fossil record shows a detailed and orderly progression. And they've gone to great lengths to accommodate this fact in their flood geology. There isn't an orderly progression. If there is any progression at all, there's a better explanation called the flood. I think fossils are separated by their density, and we'll cover that in a minute. But there is no geologic column. We covered that in video number 4. They date the rocks by the fossils, date the fossils by the rocks. It's all based on circular reasoning. Moving water and liquefaction are much better explanations for the sorting in the fossil record. There are several things that happen with high-velocity water in a flood moving around, swirling around the world. You get liquefaction, you get, of course, abrasion and simple erosion, and you get hydraulic plucking. Rapidly moving water creates a vacuum, and it sucks rocks right off the side. The big dam, the dam in Arizona, the Glen Canyon Dam in Arizona, they had water going through the pipes it was having flood season, getting rid of as much water as they could, and it started going too fast. And they saw it turn red as it came out the side. They said, oh, shut it down. It's eroding the sides of the dam. Within, I think, 20 seconds it took from the time that they got the message to shut the water down. Scuba divers went down there, and during that, I think, 20 seconds, it had eroded an area in the side of the mountain the size of a basketball court, about 4 feet deep. Sucked it right off the side. Rapidly moving water dissolves whatever it's moving against. A process called hydraulic plucking. There's another phenomenon called liquefaction. If you go stand out on the beach, walk out into the surf where the water's about knee-deep, just stand there, don't move. Every time the waves come by, the high part of the wave is heavier than the low part. There's more water. The high part is going to press the sand down. As the low part comes past you, it's going to relieve the pressure. And if you're down there with goggles looking at it, you can see the sand hopping up off the bottom. Just stand there and don't move. Within about 5 minutes, you'll be about that deep, your feet covered up in sand. And you didn't move. What's happening is the pressing and relieving of the pressure is causing a phenomenon called liquefaction. This is automatically going to sort things. Now, during the flood, you would get enormous liquefaction because just the tides. As the Earth turns under the moon, if the Earth is covered with water, the tides are still going to work during the flood, but now there's no continents to stop them. Today, the tide just gets going, and then it bumps into something like South America, so, all the energy is taken out. But during the flood, you wouldn't have that. Computer models tell us that if the Earth were covered with water, smoothed out and covered with water, the tides would change 200 feet every 6 hours and 25 minutes. Well, today here in Florida, they change, 16 inches. We don't get much tide here. I've been up to the Bay of Fundy in northern Canada where the tide changes up to 100 feet. It's a record, 102 feet. Anchorage, Alaska has the second highest tide in North America, 30-foot tidal change. You can see the water come rushing up and then 6 hours later start rushing back down. So you'd get a 200-foot tidal change during the flood. This 200 feet of water would do enormous things to the surface underneath called liquefaction. It would sort things. Actually, a guy took an aquarium, big aquarium one time, and he put a big hot water bottle in the bottom and poked it full of thousands of holes. And he hooked a hose up to it. Then he dumped into the aquarium dirt, rocks, gravel, sand, mud, dead fish, dead amphibians, dead reptiles, mixed them all up in a cement mixer, and dumped them in. Turned the hose on. Water came out through the bottom and bubbled up through this aquarium to fill up the aquarium. Of course, as it fills up the aquarium, it's going to lift the particles and then drop them again, and the denser ones drop a little faster every time. Within just a few hours of filling this aquarium, it sorted all the animals, and it put the fish at the bottom, amphibians next, reptiles next, birds on top. Automatically sorted them. Now, it would look like they got buried in that order, but no, they got sorted in that order by liquefaction. Plus, if huge areas of sand are buried under there, if something is lighter and it's buried by a heavier, denser layer on top, you can get what's called a sand plume. All of a sudden, things are moving around. Pretty soon, bloop, it bubbles to the top. And big chunks of lighter material like sand would bubble out to the top. That's probably what caused Ayers Rock in Australia. It's a giant sand plume, badly eroded today. And as you can see, if you get up close to it, there are millions of little tiny holes in it. It's probably a big, what's called a sand plume, where the sand just bubbled up through the heavier material on top of it. Liquefaction also causes the ground to turn like jelly. During earthquakes, like here's these buildings in Japan, during the earthquake, the ground shakes, all the water comes to the top, and the buildings just sink in. If animals are sorted at all, it's probably based on habitat. Evolutionists will say, Hovind, don't you know clams are found at the bottom of the geologic column? I say, well, first, they're not always found at the bottom. But if they are found at the bottom, generally, that's probably because that's where they live. Logic would tell us they'd be the first ones buried. Right? Animals might be sorted based on habitat. They might be sorted based on intelligence. You know, as far as anybody can figure out, clams are not too smart. They might be sorted based on mobility. Did you know clams can't run very fast? They might be sorted based on body density. Did you know clams are a little heavier than bird feathers? And birds are the last ones to drown in a flood. So if birds are found on top of the geologic column, that doesn't prove they evolved last. It proves they drowned last. Or they ended up floating to the top when they did drown. So the Bible says the high hills were covered. The earth was totally covered by a flood. 15 cubits, that's about 22 feet, over the mountains. Boy, God thinks of everything. That ark was 45 cubits, or 30 cubits high, 45 feet. So there was, if it had 50% underwater, which is pretty heavy for a boat, still couldn't scrape bottom on any mountains. They were perfectly safe in there. God thought of everything. So the skeptics say, where'd all the water go? Oh, it's still here. The Bible says in Genesis chapter 8, the water's assuaged. That means to drop down, to sink down. Now, NIV says the wild animals, they weren't wild animals, they were tame. And it says the water's receded. That's not technically correct. They actually assuaged it, dropped down. If we filled this room 4 feet deep in water, and then all of a sudden the floor caved in over here and dropped down 10 feet, that's going to suck all the water from there into the hole. That's what happened in Winter Garden, Florida, where the neighborhood fell in. Anybody see that? All of a sudden, about 4 houses and everything just dropped down about 30 feet. Boof. Big sinkhole developed. I think it's Winter Garden, just somewhere near Orlando. That happens occasionally around the world. Things just sink down. Well, during the flood, you'd get this sinking process as the ocean floors would drop out and the water would rush into those holes. The Bible says the water stood above the mountains. So I think during the first few months of the flood, the animals sorted out and fossils were forming. During the last part of the flood, the plates of the earth are still shifting, and they're unstable, and they began to lift up or sink down different places. Thin spots sink down, other places lift up, forming mountain ranges. Water rushes off, forming erosion in a hurry. The Bible says in Psalm 104, at thy rebuke, they fled. At the voice of thy thunder, they hasted away, talking about the water. It says they go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys. Now, many reference Bibles have a footnote right here, because this is an Old English phrase. What this is saying is the mountains arose, the valleys sank down. During the last part of the flood, the mountains actually lifted up. So, was Mount Everest underwater? Mount Everest wasn't there. It formed during the last part of the flood, as the mountains lifted up. So that area was underwater. That's how you explain the clams on top, but Mount Everest technically wasn't there until after the flood, or during the flood it formed. The ocean crust is thinner than continental crust. They know this from earthquakes, you know, checking the S&P waves with kind of like doing a sonogram of the earth. They do that all the time. Thinner spots would tend to sink down. Water's going to rush in, filling in these places, causing oceans. The crust of the earth is about 30 miles thick under the continents and about 3 miles thick 3 to 5 miles thick under the oceans. And the earth all busted up into plates like that. And some are still moving. This map shows the earthquake potential of different areas. Pensacola has just about 0 chance of getting an earthquake. Now we have a chance of getting other problems, you know, like natural disasters, like maybe hurricanes or tornadoes or politicians. But those, not much chance of an earthquake here. I think the earth crust compared to the earth is pretty thin. 30 miles compared to 8,000 is almost nothing. Kind of like a waterbed, you know. If you push down one place, someplace else lifts up. So as the earth settled out after the flood, you would get continents forming. Mountains arose, valleys sank down, water rushed off. Erosion was incredible. These pictures show the Canyon Lake Dam flood in New Braunfels, Texas, just in 2002. The water went over the top of the spillway from the flood water, and boy, it carved out canyons, washed out roadbeds in a real big hurry. Anybody who's been near a bad flood knows it doesn't take long for erosion to take place. And if you look out over the world, you can see erosion marks all over the place. I fly out west, and you look out the window, and you can see huge erosion patterns in places that never rain. Here's a Slick Rock in Arizona. Obviously, erosion did that. To me, the flood's the best explanation. When I flew from 3 days ago from Spokane, Washington over to Seattle, Washington, you can fly over and see the Channel Scablands. It's unbelievable. There's the Dry Falls, Washington out there. Largest waterfall in the world with no water going over it. That's left over from either an ice dam breaking, causing the Channel Scablands, or from the flood. This shows what's called the Three Gossips, the rocks formation standing up with John Wayne riding around there someplace. The textbooks are going to say it takes millions of years to form these things. And you can see the buttes and the elevated plateaus, you know, obviously erosion. You can go see Bryce Canyon. Beautiful. I mean, it's basically wasted real estate, but it's, you know, beautiful looking anyway. They say it takes millions of years to do that. Here's a close-up view of the same type of thing. You can see the little spires sticking up in the ground, off the ground. They say it takes millions of years. Oh, there's my ink pen on top. I don't think so. There's a pile of dirt we had in the backyard. After one rainstorm, I went out and took a picture of it. Made what looked like exactly like Bryce Canyon after one rainstorm. There's millions of years of erosion along a highway built a few months ago. Unprotected soil erodes quickly. This evidence of a giant lake and millions of years of erosion right here. You can see the obvious took millions of years to form that, boys and girls. Oh, there's my glasses. Another close-up pile of that pile of dirt. Close-up of that pile of dirt. It doesn't take long. You can go out to Montana and see these erosion features that are just enormous. I fly out west quite often. I just look out the airplane and look out the window and see, man, there was a flood. But see, God doesn't want people to look at the erosion of the world and think flood. He wants them to look at the erosion and think millions of years, because He doesn't want them to come to Christ. Here's some pictures of Dry Falls, Washington. Largest waterfall in the world, no water going over it. Just incredible erosion features. You can study that for yourself if you get time to look more into that. Talk about the water was 300 feet deep going over that waterfall. Niagara Falls is about 4 feet deep, the water going over. 300 feet deep, water going over a waterfall. There's an eastern Montana washout. It's interesting, most of the mountain ranges in the world follow the ocean basins. I think Walt Brown's theory is right on track, that the mountains arose, the valleys sank down, the wrinkling of the pressing of the plates as they're sliding would cause all this. To me, that's by far the best explanation of all this. Bent rock layers, as you see in these pictures here, see, rocks don't bend very well. Bent rock layers, to me, indicate they were bent while they were soft. During the flood, you get thousands of feet of mud, and then during the end of the flood, you get the crust of the earth twisting and contorting, and then they slowly harden and turn to rock. I was in Crystal Cove State Park in Los Angeles, California, a couple years ago. You can see the close-ups here of these bent rock layers. We got up and looked at them real close, like with a magnifying glass. There are no cracks in these rocks. These were bent while they were all very soft layers. If they were bent after they were hard, they would fracture. They're not fractured. These were all formed quickly and all bent while they were still soft, and then they hardened into rock. As the mountains arose, the valleys sank down, the pressure would cause metamorphic rock, like marble, like they make tombstones out of. That's a result of the twisting of the crust of the earth. Skeptics say, how did the kangaroos get to Australia then? I mean, if after the flood, Noah got off the ark, all the critters got off, but how did the kangaroos end up in Australia? Australia is surrounded by water. Kangaroos can't swim very well, they'll say. When Noah got off the ark, the continents were actually larger than they are today. Now, this is going to sound strange, but let me explain. The oceans were smaller because there was still a bunch of ice at the North and South Pole. If you froze a few zillion gallons of water and stuck them on the North and South Pole, that's going to lower the ocean level. This map shows England would not be an island if the water was a little bit lower. You know the deepest point of the English Channel is 150 feet? That's twice the width of this room. That's the deepest point. 30 miles wide, 150 feet deep. Do that on a graph paper to scale. It's a straight line. You could actually walk out to Ireland and to Iceland right after the flood. You can see on this satellite view showing the sunset coming into England, you can see the continental shelf. The water's not deep. As you fly into Pensacola, you can see the water's not very deep out there, folks, for quite a ways out. Between Alaska and Russia, the water's only like 60 feet deep, the width of this room. All you'd have to do is lower the water just a little bit, and everything's connected. So I think right after the flood, the oceans were smaller because the continents were bigger, because the water was trapped in the form of ice at the North and South Pole. If the oceans were just 10% deeper, this would be the beach right here. The world is basically pretty smooth, pretty flat. When I flew into Galveston, Texas, you get off at the airport and said, "Welcome to Galveston, elevation 7." I thought, man, one good wave and we're underwater here, you know, 7 feet above sea level. Not much. Florida used to be gigantic after the flood. Probably the continental shelf is where the beach used to be. You could actually walk to Cuba, jump over the creek. It could be the Gulf of Mexico filled in a few hundred years after the flood, and water came pouring in as the Atlantic filled up. It would pour in and fill in the Gulf of Mexico, carving out the grooves around Cuba. That could have happened after the flood. To me, it's a logical explanation. Mobile Bay, Pensacola Bay, generally less than 7 feet deep. Sometimes when hurricanes come and the air's swirling the right way, it'll dry up both bays. The water sucks right out. Between Australia and Vietnam, the water's only 30, 40, 50 feet deep. Not much. So if you lowered the ocean level by freezing larger ice caps, you're going to get huge continental shelves connecting everything. So kangaroos, wombats, koalas, all these less aggressive animals, getting off the ark, they're less aggressive, and they would tend to rather run than fight. So as they move out, they settle in and make a house, and then the tiger moves in. Kangaroo says, "We're moving, guys. We're not going to stay by the tiger." And so they would tend to continually be at the front edge, at the fringe of the migration wave. It would probably take a few hundred years, for animals to spread out around the world. And they would continually give up their territory to the more aggressive animals. And when they get to Australia, they run out of places to go. But by now the water's coming up, and pretty soon Australia is isolated. So the reason we find kangaroos in Australia is because they were at the leading edge of the migration wave, running from the predators. And then they got trapped with no enemies. Hey, big island. It's all to ourselves, guys. Let's go have some kids and grandkids. And then they're covered up, with kangaroos over there. So it's not because that's where they evolved. It's because the flood's a good explanation for that. Kangaroo fossils are found other places, but they didn't survive in those regions. They had too many predators. So why do we have a continental shelf? I think the ice caps melting back explains the continental shelf, explains why the oceans are wider and deeper and colder from the ice melting back, absorbing the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Next session, we'll finish up a little bit more on the Hovind theory and then tell you the importance of all this. This flood is powerful evidence of God's judgment on sin. And if you've not trusted Christ as your Savior, you're going to be judged in front of God for yourself, what you've done in your flesh and in your body. You'll be judged without Christ. Man, I wouldn't want that. I'm going to stand there with Christ's righteousness on me. Say, "Lord, you better let me into heaven because Jesus forgave my sin." Cover more on that in the next session.